Pay attention to the young man in the orange jumpsuit. Behind him, separated by a glass partition, his mother sits with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles have turned white. But right now, in this moment, 17-year-old Cameron Mitchell still believes he's untouchable. He believes his mother will protect him, just like she always has. He's wrong. The crime Cameron committed was so brutal, so senseless, that even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to process the scene. The victim was a 32-year-old man named Marcus Sullivan, a delivery driver who had worked double shifts for 8 months straight to save enough money for his daughter's medical treatment. Marcus had a genetic heart condition, but he pushed through 60-hour weeks because his daughter, Emma, just 6 years old, needed a specialized surgery that insurance wouldn't fully cover. He was 3 weeks away from having enough. 3 weeks from being able to schedule the procedure that would give his little girl a normal childhood. Instead, his body was found in a drainage ditch off Route 47, his skull fractured in 3 places, his wallet missing, his company van discovered 4 miles away with the ignition still running. The medical examiner determined that Marcus had been beaten with a blunt object, likely a metal pipe or bat. The force of the blows had been so extreme that fragments of his skull had embedded in his brain tissue. He hadn't died immediately. The autopsy revealed that Marcus had been conscious for at least 15 minutes after the initial attack, during which time he'd been dragged approximately 60 feet, leaving a trail of blood and tissue along the gravel shoulder of the road. The examiner noted defensive wounds on Marcus's hands and forearms, deep lacerations that indicated he'd fought desperately to protect himself. DNA evidence collected from beneath his fingernails would later prove crucial, but in those first hours after the discovery of his body, investigators had almost nothing to work with. What made the case particularly haunting was the sheer randomness of it. Marcus hadn't been targeted because of who he was or what he'd done. He'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, making a delivery to a rural address just after sunset. The property where he'd stopped was a foreclosed farmhouse, long abandoned, with a gravel driveway that wound through overgrown fields. Someone had placed an online order for food delivery, using a prepaid debit card and a fake name. The order had been placed at 7:43 p.m. on March 14, 2024. Marcus accepted the delivery at 8:02 p.m., his GPS tracker showing his route as he left the main highway and turned onto County Road 1847. His van's movement stopped at 8:31 p.m. The emergency call reporting a body wasn't made until 6:47 a.m. the following morning, when a farmer driving past saw what he initially thought was a pile of discarded clothing in the ditch. Detective Sarah Brennan arrived on scene at 7:15 a.m. She'd been with the Major Crimes Unit for 11 years, had worked over 200 homicides, but she told reporters later that something about Marcus's case immediately struck her as different. The level of violence was extreme, yes, but it was also strangely disorganized. The body had been dragged, but not hidden. The van had been abandoned with the engine running, just left in the middle of the road with the driver's side door hanging open. Marcus's phone was missing, but his wedding ring, worth at least $800, was still on his finger. It was as if the killer had panicked mid-crime, had grabbed what they could and fled without any real plan. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A woman named Patricia Holt, who lived in a trailer park approximately 2 miles from the crime scene, called the police tip line on March 16th. She told the operator that her son had come home around 9 o'clock on the night of March 14th with blood on his shoes and pants. When she'd asked him about it, he'd told her he'd hit a deer while driving. But Patricia hadn't believed him. Her son didn't have a car. He'd lost his license 6 months earlier after his 3rd DUI, and he'd been living with her while on probation. She'd noticed something else, too. Her son had a new phone, an expensive iPhone that he clearly hadn't owned the day before. When she'd asked where he'd gotten it, he'd become defensive and angry, locking himself in his room for the rest of the night. Detective Brennan and her partner, Luis Cardenas, drove out to interview Patricia's son that same afternoon. His name was Dylan Holt, 24 years old, and he had a criminal record that stretched back to his teenage years: theft, assault, drug possession, DUI. He'd served 3 separate jail sentences, the longest being 18 months for armed robbery. When the detectives knocked on the trailer door, Dylan initially refused to speak to them. His mother, however, let them inside, and they could immediately see that Dylan was high. His pupils were dilated, his speech slurred, and when Detective Cardenas asked to see his shoes, Dylan lunged at him, trying to push past and run out the door. It took both detectives to restrain him, and during the struggle, a phone fell out of Dylan's pocket. It was Marcus Sullivan's phone, still smeared with blood. Dylan was arrested and taken into custody, and his trailer was searched. In a cardboard box under his bed, investigators found a metal pipe, 3 feet long, with biological material caked on one end. Preliminary tests confirmed it was human blood. The DNA match to Marcus Sullivan came back within 48 hours. It seemed like an open and shut case. Dylan had a motive, albeit a pathetic one. He'd needed money for drugs and had decided to rob a delivery driver. He had the murder weapon, the victim's phone, and his own mother had turned him in. But as Detective Brennan interviewed Dylan over the following days, a second, far more disturbing picture began to emerge. Dylan insisted he hadn't acted alone. He claimed that his accomplice, the person who'd actually planned the entire robbery, was a kid named Cameron Mitchell. Dylan said Cameron had contacted him 3 days before the murder, proposing the scheme. Cameron had explained that they could order food delivery to an abandoned location, wait for the driver to arrive, rob him, and disappear before anyone noticed. Dylan admitted he'd been skeptical at first, but Cameron had been persistent, even offering to split the take 50-50. According to Dylan, Cameron had been the one to place the order, using a prepaid card he'd bought with cash. Cameron had been the one who'd chosen the location, an area he knew well because he'd grown up on a farm just 6 miles away. And Cameron, Dylan insisted, had been the one to strike the first blow. Detective Brennan was initially skeptical. In her experience, criminals often tried to shift blame, especially when facing murder charges. But when she pulled Cameron Mitchell's background, she found something that gave her pause. Cameron was only 17, but he'd already been in trouble with the law multiple times. At 14, he'd been arrested for arson after setting fire to a neighbor's shed. At 15, he'd been caught stealing electronics from his high school. At 16, he'd been suspended for bringing a knife to class and threatening another. Student. His juvenile record was sealed, but the pattern was clear. Cameron Mitchell was escalating, and each offense was more violent than the last. What troubled Detective Brennan even more was Cameron's home life. His father, Robert Mitchell, had died in a farming accident when Cameron was 12. Robert had been working alone, repairing a piece of equipment, when the machinery malfunctioned and trapped him. He'd bled to death before anyone found him. Cameron's mother, Linda Mitchell, had never recovered from the loss. She'd become severely depressed, spending most of her time in bed, barely able to care for herself, let alone her son. Cameron had essentially raised himself from age 12 onward, and by all accounts, he'd done so with almost no supervision or guidance. Teachers reported that he'd frequently come to school hungry, wearing dirty clothes, smelling of cigarette smoke. Social services had been called twice, but Linda had managed to present just enough stability during their visits to avoid losing custody. On March 18th, Detective Brennan and Detective Cardenas drove to the Mitchell farm to interview Cameron. They found him in the barn, working on a dirt bike, his hands covered in grease. He was tall for his age, nearly 6 feet, with dark hair that hung over his eyes and a lean, muscular build from years of farm work. When the detectives introduced themselves and asked if they could talk, Cameron agreed immediately, showing no signs of nervousness or concern. He told them he'd heard about Marcus Sullivan's murder on the news and thought it was terrible. When they asked if he knew Dylan Holt, Cameron said yes, they'd met a few times through mutual friends, but he didn't know Dylan well. When they asked where Cameron had been on the night of March 14th, he said he'd been home with his mother watching television. Linda Mitchell, when questioned separately, confirmed this alibi without hesitation. But Detective Brennan noticed something. As Cameron spoke, he kept touching his right hand, rubbing his knuckles as if they were sore. She asked if he'd injured himself recently, and Cameron explained that he'd scraped his hand while working on the dirt bike. He showed her the wound, a series of abrasions across his knuckles that were consistent with his story. Except the medical examiner had noted that Marcus Sullivan's defensive wounds suggested he'd struck his attacker multiple times, hard enough to leave bruising or cuts. And Cameron's injuries were fresh, no more than 3 or 4 days old. Detective Brennan asked Cameron if he'd be willing to provide a DNA sample for exclusionary purposes. Cameron agreed without hesitation, even seeming eager to cooperate. He rolled up his sleeve and let the technician swab the inside of his cheek. He signed the consent form with a flourish, smiled at the detectives, and told them he hoped they caught whoever had killed Marcus. It was only later, after the detectives had left and were driving back to the station, that Detective Cardenas turned to his partner and said something that would haunt the investigation. That kid's not nervous because he thinks he's smarter than us. The DNA results came back on March 22nd. Cameron Mitchell's DNA was found beneath Marcus Sullivan's fingernails, mixed with Dylan Holt's. It was found on the metal pipe used to beat Marcus to death, and it was found on Marcus's phone, specifically on the home button and screen. The evidence was overwhelming. Cameron had been there, he'd participated in the attack, and contrary to Dylan's claim that Cameron had struck the first blow, the forensic analysis suggested something even more disturbing. The blood spatter patterns on Cameron's clothing, which had been seized during a search warrant execution, indicated that he'd been standing over Marcus during the sustained beating, raining down blows while the victim was already on the ground, already incapacitated. Dylan had started the attack, yes, but Cameron had finished it. and he'd done so with a level of brutality that suggested he'd enjoyed it. Cameron Mitchell was arrested on March 23, 2024, and charged as an adult with first-degree murder, armed robbery, and kidnapping. The prosecution argued that because Cameron had lured Marcus to the location using false pretenses, it qualified as kidnapping under state law. Because the murder had occurred during the commission of a felony, it qualified for the death penalty, though Cameron's age made him ineligible for execution. The maximum sentence he faced was life in prison without the possibility of parole. His bail was set at $2 million, an amount his mother had no hope of posting. Cameron was remanded to the county jail, where he would remain for the next 11 months awaiting trial. The prosecution's case was led by Assistant District Attorney Monica Reeves, a veteran prosecutor with a conviction rate of over 90%. She'd handled dozens of murder trials, but she told colleagues that the Mitchell case was one of the most clear-cut she'd ever seen. The physical evidence was ironclad. The DNA, the blood spatter, the victim's phone, all of it pointed directly to Cameron. Dylan Holt had agreed to testify against Cameron in exchange for a reduced charge of second-degree murder, which carried a sentence of 25 years to life instead of mandatory life without parole. Monica had her star witness, her physical evidence, and a defendant with a documented history of violence. The only wild card was Cameron himself. Throughout the pretrial proceedings, Cameron's behavior was erratic and disturbing. During his arraignment, when the judge read the charges against him, Cameron had laughed out loud, causing the judge to threaten him with contempt. During a bond hearing, when Marcus Sullivan's widow testified about the impact of his death on their family, Cameron had yawned conspicuously and examined his fingernails. His defense attorney, a public defender named Thomas Garrett, repeatedly warned Cameron that his demeanor was hurting his case, that the jury would see him as callous and unremorseful. Cameron's response, according to court transcripts, was to tell Garrett that he didn't care what the jury thought because he didn't do anything wrong. This was Cameron's defense strategy, thin as it was. He claimed that yes, he'd been present at the scene, yes, he'd helped Dylan plan the robbery, but he insisted he hadn't touched Marcus Sullivan, hadn't struck a single blow, and that all the physical evidence had been transferred through secondary contact. It was a ludicrous argument, one that ignored the blood spatter evidence, the DNA under the victim's fingernails, and the testimony of Dylan Holt. But Cameron clung to it, and his mother supported him completely. Linda Mitchell, in every interview, insisted her son was innocent, that he was being framed, that the police had targeted him because of his troubled past. She mortgaged her farm to pay for private investigators, for expert witnesses, for anything that might help prove Cameron's innocence. She sat in the front row of every hearing, staring at the prosecutors with open hostility, mouthing the words, "I love you," to Cameron every time he entered or left the courtroom. The trial began on February 3, 2025, nearly 11 months after Marcus Sullivan's murder. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims' advocates, and members of both families. Marcus's widow, Jennifer Sullivan, sat in the front row on the prosecution's side, flanked by Marcus's parents and siblings. Linda Mitchell sat directly across from them, her face pale and drawn, her hands clutching a rosary. Cameron, wearing a dress shirt and tie that his mother had brought him, sat at the defense table with an expression that could only be described as bored indifference. When the jury was brought in, 12 men and women who would decide his fate, Cameron didn't even look at them. He was doodling on a legal pad, drawing what appeared to be cartoon characters. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating. Monica Reeves stood before the jury and walked them through every piece of evidence, every timeline marker, every forensic detail that proved Cameron Mitchell had not only participated in Marcus Sullivan's murder, but had been the primary aggressor. She showed them photographs of Marcus's injuries, close-up images of the skull fractures, the defensive wounds, the drag marks on his body. She showed them the metal pipe, still tagged as evidence, the biological material on its surface visible even through the plastic bag, and she introduced them to Dylan Holt, who would testify that Cameron had been the one to insist they kill Marcus, that leaving a witness alive was too risky, that they needed to finish the job. The defense's opening statement was brief and almost apologetic. Thomas Garrett acknowledged that Cameron had made terrible decisions, that he'd been present at the scene, that he'd helped plan a robbery that went horribly wrong. But he argued that Cameron had been manipulated by Dylan Holt, an adult with an extensive criminal history who'd preyed on a troubled teenager. Garrett told the jury that Cameron had been a bystander, paralyzed by fear, unable to stop what was happening. It was a weak argument, and from the jurors' expressions, it was clear they didn't believe a word of it. The prosecution's case unfolded over 6 days. Dylan Holt took the stand and testified that Cameron had been the one to make first contact with him, that Cameron had described the plan in detail, even drawing a map of the location and explaining the best escape routes. Dylan admitted his own role, his own culpability, but he insisted that once they'd robbed Marcus, once they'd taken his phone and wallet, he'd wanted to leave. Cameron, however, had picked up the pipe. Dylan described the moment with chilling clarity. Marcus had been on his knees, begging them to let him go, promising he wouldn't tell anyone. Cameron had walked behind him, raised the pipe, and brought it down on the back of Marcus's skull with enough force that the sound, Dylan said, was like a watermelon being dropped on concrete. The medical examiner testified about Marcus's injuries, explaining to the jury in clinical detail how each blow would have caused progressively more damage, how the victim's brain had swelled inside his fractured skull, how he'd aspirated blood into his lungs as he lay dying. The forensic experts testified about the DNA evidence, the blood spatter patterns, the transfer evidence that proved Cameron had been in direct physical contact with Marcus during the attack. Marcus's widow testified about the night he'd left for work, how he'd kissed Emma goodbye, how he'd promised to bring her back French fries from the restaurant he was delivering from. She testified about the phone call she'd received from the police the next morning, about identifying his body, about telling her 6-year-old daughter that Daddy wasn't coming home. Through all of this, Cameron showed no emotion. He sat at the defense table, occasionally whispering to his attorney, sometimes sketching on his legal pad, but never showing a flicker of remorse or sadness. The jurors noticed. They stared at him, clearly disturbed by his affect, his complete disconnection from the horror being described around him. And then came the moment that would define the trial, the moment that would be replayed on news broadcasts around the country, the moment when Cameron Mitchell made his fatal mistake. It happened on the 6th day of testimony. The prosecution had just rested its case, and Judge Harold Brenneman was giving final instructions before the defense began presenting its witnesses. As the judge spoke, Cameron leaned back in his chair, stretched his arms above his head, and yawned loudly enough that several jurors turned to look at him. Judge Brenneman stopped mid-sentence. He stared at Cameron for a long moment, then asked, "Mr. Mitchell, am I boring you?" Cameron, instead of apologizing, instead of showing even a hint of contrition, smiled. He looked directly at the judge and said, "Kind of, yeah." The courtroom erupted. Jennifer Sullivan gasped. Several reporters jumped to their feet. Thomas Garrett grabbed Cameron's arm, trying to get him to shut up, but Cameron shook him off. Judge Brenneman, his face flushing red, slammed his gavel and demanded order. He pointed at Cameron and said, "Young man, you are on trial for murder. I suggest you show this court the respect it deserves." Cameron's response would be quoted in every news article about the trial. He leaned forward, rested his chin on his hand and said, "Or what? You'll give me life in prison? You're going to do that anyway, so why should I care what you think?" Judge Brenneman held Cameron in contempt, ordering him to spend the night in isolation and fining him $500. But the damage was done. The jury had seen Cameron's true face, his absolute lack of remorse, his contempt not just for the court, but for the life he'd taken. Monica Reeves later said that if she'd scripted Cameron's self-destruction, she couldn't have done it better. He'd shown the jury exactly who he was, and there was no coming back from it. But the most dramatic moment of the trial was still to come. The defense, despite having almost no case to present, called 3 witnesses. The first was a psychologist who testified that Cameron suffered from attachment disorder stemming from his father's death and his mother's subsequent depression. The second was a teacher who described Cameron as a bright student who'd been failed by the system. The third witness was supposed to be Linda Mitchell herself, who would testify about her son's character, about how he'd been a loving child who'd simply lost his way after trauma. Thomas Garrett had prepared her extensively, coaching her on what to say, how to present herself, how to humanize Cameron in the eyes of the jury. But something happened between the time Linda was prepped and the time she was called to the stand. Something shifted inside her. Some final barrier of denial finally crumbling under the weight of truth. Because when Linda Mitchell took the stand on February 12, 2025, when she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, she did something that shocked everyone in that courtroom, including her own son. She told the truth. Linda Mitchell sat in the witness box, her hands trembling in her lap, and she looked directly at her son for the first time since the trial had begun. Cameron was staring at her with an expression of confidence, clearly expecting her to deliver the testimony they'd rehearsed. Instead, Linda turned to the jury, took a deep breath, and began to speak. She told them about the night Cameron had come home after Marcus's murder. She said she'd been in bed, like always, but she'd heard the front door open around 9:15. She'd heard Cameron go directly to the bathroom, heard the shower running for nearly an hour. When he'd finally come out, Linda had gotten up to check on him. She'd found him in his bedroom, stuffing bloody clothes into a trash bag. She'd asked him what had happened, and Cameron had told her he'd gotten into a fight with some guys at a party, that it was nothing, that she should go back to bed. Linda testified that she'd believed him at first, or rather she'd wanted to believe him. But the next morning, when she'd seen the news about Marcus Sullivan's murder, when she'd heard that a delivery driver had been beaten to death just 6 miles from their farm, she'd felt something cold and terrible settle in her chest. She'd gone to Cameron's room and searched through his things. She'd found the trash bag, hidden in the back of his closet, still containing the bloody clothes. She'd found Marcus's wallet, empty of cash but with his ID and credit card still inside, stuffed into a boot. And she'd found a piece of paper with an address written on it. The address of the abandoned farmhouse where Marcus had been killed. The courtroom was silent. Thomas Garrett was frantically writing notes, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Monica Reeves was leaning forward, barely breathing, letting Linda's testimony unfold without interruption. And Cameron was staring at his mother with an expression that had finally shifted from boredom to rage. Linda continued. She testified that she'd confronted Cameron that morning, had shown him the evidence she'd found, had demanded to know what he'd done. Cameron had laughed at her. He'd told her that she had no proof, that she was delusional, that he'd get rid of the evidence and no one would ever connect him to the crime. Linda had threatened to call the police and Cameron had grabbed her by the throat. He'd slammed her against the wall and told her that if she said a word to anyone, he'd kill her too. He'd said it calmly, matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather. And Linda, terrified of her own son, had said nothing. She testified that she'd spent the next 5 days living in fear, watching Cameron move through the house like nothing had happened, watching him get rid of evidence piece by piece. He'd burned the clothes in a barrel behind the barn. He'd thrown Marcus's wallet into a creek 3 miles away. He'd wiped down Marcus's phone with bleach before giving it to Dylan, telling Linda that if the cops ever found it, all the evidence would point to Dylan, not him. Linda had stayed silent through all of it, paralyzed by fear and denial, clinging to the desperate hope that her son couldn't really be capable of murder. And then the police had arrested Dylan Holt, and Dylan had given Cameron's name. Linda had still said nothing. When the detectives came to interview Cameron, when they'd asked for an alibi, Linda had lied for him. She'd told them he'd been home with her all night, watching television, never leaving the house. She'd signed a statement to that effect. She'd looked those detectives in the eye and protected the person who'd murdered an innocent man, because he was her son, and she couldn't bear to lose him too. Linda's voice broke as she testified about the moment she'd realized she couldn't keep lying. It had been during the prosecution's case when Jennifer Sullivan had taken the stand. Jennifer had described Marcus's relationship with Emma, how he'd worked himself to exhaustion to pay for her surgery, how Emma still slept with one of Marcus's shirts because it smelled like him. Jennifer had shown the jury a video on her phone, a clip of Marcus and Emma at the park, just 2 weeks before his death. Marcus was pushing Emma on a swing, and she was screaming with laughter, her face bright with joy. Marcus was smiling at her with such pure, uncomplicated love that it hurt to watch. Linda testified that watching that video, she'd seen her own son in Emma's place. She'd remembered Robert pushing Cameron on that same kind of swing, remembered the sound of Cameron's laughter, remembered when he'd been innocent and sweet and full of potential. And she'd realized that the person who'd killed Marcus, who'd robbed Emma of her father, wasn't the little boy she remembered. That little boy was gone, had been gone for years, and in his place was someone Linda didn't recognize, someone she was terrified of. She told the jury that she'd spent the entire night before her testimony praying, asking God for guidance, asking Robert for forgiveness. And she'd realized that the only way to honor Marcus Sullivan's memory, the only way to give Jennifer and Emma any measure of justice, was to tell the truth. Even if it meant her son would spend the rest of his life in prison, even if it meant Cameron would never forgive her, because keeping silent, continuing to protect him, would make her complicit in Marcus's murder. Linda looked at Cameron then, tears streaming down her face, and said, "I love you. I will always love you. But I can't protect you anymore. What you did was evil, and Marcus Sullivan's family deserves to know the truth." Cameron exploded. He lunged to his feet, slamming his hands on the defense table, and screamed at his mother, "You lying bitch, you're supposed to be on my side." The bailiffs moved immediately, grabbing Cameron by the arms, but he fought against them, still screaming, "I'm your son, how can you do this to me? I hate you, I fucking hate you." Judge Brenneman ordered Cameron removed from the courtroom. As the bailiffs dragged him toward the door, Cameron twisted around to look at his mother one last time. Linda was sobbing, her entire body shaking, but she met his eyes. Cameron spat at her, the saliva falling short, but the gesture clear. "You're dead to me," he shouted. "You hear me? You're fucking dead." The door slammed shut behind him, and the courtroom remained in stunned silence. Linda Mitchell collapsed in the witness box, her sobs the only sound. Jennifer Sullivan was crying too, and several of the jurors were wiping their eyes. Thomas Garrett looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Monica Reeves simply sat back in her chair, knowing that the case was over. Nothing more needed to be said. The prosecution's cross-examination of Linda was brief and gentle. Monica asked only a few clarifying questions, establishing the timeline of events, confirming that Linda had found the physical evidence in Cameron's room, that Cameron had threatened her, that she'd lied to protect him. Linda answered every question clearly, her voice steady despite her tears. When Monica said she had no further questions, Judge Brenneman asked the defense if they wished to redirect. Thomas Garrett stood, looked at Linda for a long moment, and said, "No, Your Honor, no further questions." Linda stepped down from the witness box and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. She would later tell reporters that leaving that courtroom was the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder even than burying her husband. Because when Robert had died, it had been an accident, a tragedy she couldn't have prevented. But Cameron's fate was a direct result of her testimony, and she would carry that weight for the rest of her life. The defense rested without calling any additional witnesses. There was nothing left to say. Thomas Garrett gave his closing argument the following day, and it was clear his heart wasn't in it. He argued that Cameron had been a troubled teenager who'd made catastrophic decisions, but that he deserved a chance at rehabilitation, at redemption. He asked the jury to consider Cameron's youth, his traumatic childhood, his lack of positive role models. But after Linda's testimony, after Cameron's outburst, the argument felt hollow. Monica Reeves's closing argument was powerful and direct. She walked the jury through the evidence one final time, but she focused primarily on Marcus Sullivan. She talked about his dreams for his daughter, his work ethic, his fundamental decency. She described the terror he must have felt in his final moments, the pain he must have endured, the desperate hope that someone would save him. She reminded the jury that Marcus had fought to survive, had fought to get back to Emma, and that Cameron Mitchell had taken that from him with no justification, no provocation, no reason beyond greed and cruelty. She ended her argument by addressing Cameron's behavior during the trial. She said, "The defendant showed you exactly who he is. He mocked this court. He mocked the memory of Marcus Sullivan. He showed no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the magnitude of what he's done. And when his own mother, the one person who loved him unconditionally, found the courage to tell the truth, he called her a liar and threatened her. That is the person asking for your mercy. That is the person asking you to believe he deserves a second chance." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, armed robbery, kidnapping. When the foreperson read the verdict, Cameron showed no reaction. He simply stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his hands flat on the table. Jennifer Sullivan sobbed with relief, surrounded by her family. Linda Mitchell, sitting alone in the back of the courtroom, put her face in her hands. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. Under state law, Cameron's age made him ineligible for the death penalty, but he faced mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Brenneman heard victim impact statements from Marcus's family. Jennifer spoke about Emma's recurring nightmares, about how she asked every night when Daddy was coming home, about the surgery they'd had to postpone because they could no longer afford it. Marcus's mother spoke about the hole in their family that would never heal, about the grandchildren Marcus would never meet, about the life he'd never get to live. When it was time for Cameron to make a statement, Thomas Garrett advised him to express remorse, to apologize to the Sullivan family, to ask for mercy from the court. Cameron ignored him. He stood, looked directly at Judge Brenneman, and said, "I'm 17 years old, and you're sending me to prison for the rest of my life. That's the real crime here." Judge Brenneman's response was measured but firm. He told Cameron that he'd had every opportunity to take responsibility for his actions, to show remorse, to demonstrate that he understood the gravity of what he'd done. Instead, Cameron had shown nothing but contempt, for the court, for the victim's family, for his own mother. Judge Brenneman said that in 30 years on the bench, he'd never encountered a defendant so devoid of empathy or conscience. He sentenced Cameron to life in prison without the possibility of parole, with the sentences for armed robbery and kidnapping to run consecutively, ensuring that even if some future legal challenge overturned the murder conviction, Cameron would remain incarcerated for at least 40 years. As the bailiffs led Cameron out of the courtroom for the final time, he turned and scanned the gallery until he found his mother. Linda was standing in the back row, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. Cameron stared at her for a long moment, then smiled. It was cold and hateful, and it said everything about who Cameron Mitchell had become. Linda fled the courtroom, and according to witnesses, she collapsed in the hallway outside, overcome with grief. The aftermath of the trial was brutal for everyone involved. Jennifer Sullivan used the media attention to launch a fundraising campaign for Emma's surgery. Within 2 weeks, she'd raised over $200,000, enough to not only pay for the procedure, but to establish a trust fund for Emma's future medical expenses. Emma's surgery was successful, and she's now a healthy 8-year-old who has no memory of her father beyond the stories her mother tells her. Dylan Holt was sentenced to 25 years to life for second-degree murder. He'll be eligible for parole when he's 49 years old. In prison, he's reportedly completed his GED and enrolled in vocational training programs. He's written letters to the Sullivan family apologizing for his role in Marcus's death, though Jennifer has never responded and has stated publicly that she never will. Linda Mitchell sold her farm 6 months after the trial. She couldn't afford to keep it, and she couldn't bear to live in the house where she'd raised a son who'd become a killer. She moved to a different state, changed her last name, and severed all contact with Cameron. She's never visited him in prison and has said in interviews that she can't. She says she still loves her son, will always love him, but that loving him doesn't mean protecting him from the consequences of his actions. She lives with the knowledge that her testimony ensured his conviction, and she's found some measure of peace in knowing she did the right thing, even though it cost her everything. Cameron Mitchell is currently incarcerated at a maximum security prison in an undisclosed location. Prison records indicate he's been placed in administrative segregation multiple times for violent behavior, including assaulting other inmates and threatening correctional officers. He's refused all psychological counseling and has expressed no interest in rehabilitation programs. He's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. His projected release date, should he ever become eligible for parole through changes in sentencing laws, is 2089. He will be 82 years old. The case sparked a broader conversation about juvenile justice and the question of whether teenagers who commit heinous crimes should be treated as adults. Some advocacy groups argued that Cameron's sentence was too harsh, that his brain wasn't fully developed at 17, that he deserved a chance at rehabilitation. Others, including victims' rights organizations, pointed to Cameron's behavior during the trial, his complete lack of remorse, and the premeditated nature of his crime as evidence that some juvenile offenders pose such a danger to society that life sentences are justified. Legal scholars have studied the case extensively, particularly Linda Mitchell's testimony. Her decision to testify against her own son, to voluntarily provide evidence that ensured his conviction, is rare in criminal justice. Most parents, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of their child's guilt, choose to support them unconditionally. Linda's choice represented a different kind of love, one that prioritized truth and justice over blind loyalty. Psychologists who've studied her decision suggest it may have been the only way she could reconcile her role as a mother with her moral responsibility as a human being. The Marcus Sullivan Memorial Scholarship Fund was established in 2025 and provides financial assistance to children of crime, victims who need medical care. It's raised over $500,000 and has helped 32 families so far. Jennifer Sullivan serves on the board and speaks regularly at fundraising events. She's remarried and had another child, a son named Marcus Jr., who will never meet the uncle he was named after, but will grow up hearing stories about his kindness and sacrifice. Emma Sullivan, now 8 years old, is thriving. She's an active, happy child who loves soccer and art. She knows her father was killed, knows that bad people hurt him, but her mother has shielded her from the details of how he died. Jennifer says that one day when Emma is older, she'll tell her the full story. But for now, she wants Emma to remember Marcus as the loving father who pushed her on swings and brought her French fries, not as the victim of a senseless crime. The abandoned farmhouse where Marcus was killed has been demolished. The property was purchased by a developer who plans to build a community center on the site. There will be a memorial garden dedicated to Marcus, with a plaque that reads, "In memory of Marcus Sullivan, beloved father and husband, whose life was taken while he worked to provide for his family. May his sacrifice remind us of the value of every human life and the devastating cost of violence." The case file remains open in the technical sense, though there are no active investigations. Detective Sarah Brennan retired in 2026, citing the emotional toll of her work. She said in interviews that the Mitchell case was one of the hardest she ever worked, not because of the complexity of the investigation, but because of Cameron's youth. She says she still thinks about him, wonders if there was anything that could have been done differently, any intervention that might have changed his trajectory. But she's concluded that some people are simply broken in ways that can't be fixed, and that society's responsibility is to protect potential victims, even if it means accepting that some offenders will never be rehabilitated. The courtroom video of Cameron's outburst has been viewed millions of times online. It's become a teaching tool. In law schools, used to demonstrate how a defendant's behavior can influence a jury. It's also been analyzed by psychologists studying antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy in adolescents. Cameron's complete lack of empathy, his inability to understand why his mother's testimony was devastating to his case, his rage at being held accountable, all of it points to a fundamental defect in his emotional and moral development. Thomas Garrett, Cameron's public defender, left criminal defense work after the trial. He now teaches law at a small university and has written extensively about the ethical challenges of defending clients who are clearly guilty. He said that the Mitchell case forced him to confront the limits of advocacy, the point at which defending a client's legal rights conflicts with one's own moral obligations. He's concluded that he did his job competently, but that doesn't make him feel better about having argued for mercy on behalf of someone like Cameron Mitchell. Monica Reeves continues to prosecute major crimes and has maintained her high conviction rate. She said that the Mitchell case was professionally satisfying in that justice was served, but personally devastating because of the human cost. She thinks often about Linda Mitchell's courage, about the impossible choice she made between her son and her conscience. Monica has a son of her own, close to Cameron's age, and she's admitted that she doesn't know if she could have done what Linda did. She hopes she never has to find out. The metal pipe used to kill Marcus Sullivan is stored in the county's evidence facility, cataloged and preserved in case of future appeals. It will likely remain there for the rest of Cameron's life, a silent witness to a crime that destroyed multiple families and exposed the darkest capacities of human nature. Cameron Mitchell turned 18 in prison just 4 months after his sentencing. He's now been incarcerated for over a year and will remain there for the rest of his natural life unless dramatic changes in sentencing laws occur. He receives mail occasionally, mostly from true crime enthusiasts and women who are attracted to violent criminals, but he's never responded to any of it. He's listed no approved visitors on his prison account, and his mother's name is specifically blocked at her request. Linda Mitchell, now living under her new name, has become an advocate for parents of children who commit crimes. She speaks at conferences and support groups about the shame and guilt parents experience, about the impossible balance between love and accountability. She's written a memoir, though it's been published under a pseudonym, describing her experience raising Cameron after her husband's death, the warning signs she missed or minimized, and the moment she realized she had to testify against him. The book ends with her statement that loving your child doesn't mean enabling their worst behaviors, and that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is allow their child to face the full consequences of their actions. She's never said whether she regrets her testimony. When interviewers ask, she simply says that she couldn't live with herself if she'd continued to lie. Marcus Sullivan deserved better. Emma deserved better. And in some way she can't fully articulate, Cameron deserved better too, deserved to be held accountable, to face the truth of what he'd done, even if he'll never accept it. The question that haunts everyone involved in the case is whether Cameron could have been saved. Were there interventions that might have prevented him from becoming a killer? Could better mental health resources, better school support, a more attentive social services system have changed his trajectory? Or was Cameron simply born without the capacity for empathy, his father's death and mother's depression merely accelerating an inevitable descent into violence? There are no clear answers, and that uncertainty is what makes the case so disturbing. Cameron Mitchell was 17 years old, legally a child, when he murdered Marcus Sullivan. But the crime he committed, the brutality of it, the lack of remorse he's shown, all of it suggests someone fundamentally incapable of change. And so society has made the decision that protecting future potential victims is more important than giving Cameron a second chance. Whether that's justice or tragedy depends on your perspective, and the debate continues. What's undeniable is that Marcus Sullivan's death created a ripple effect of devastation. Emma will grow up without her father. Jennifer will never again feel the security and love of her marriage. Marcus's parents will never recover from outliving their son. Linda Mitchell lost her only child, even though he's still alive. Dylan Holt's life is effectively over, his prime years to be spent in a cell. Everything from here is simply running out the clock until death, in a system designed to punish rather than redeem. The teen killer who mocked the judge learned too late that defiance has consequences. His own mother's testimony ensured his conviction, and her courage in choosing truth over blind loyalty stands as the most powerful rebuke of his crimes. Cameron Mitchell destroyed Marcus Sullivan's life in a drainage ditch off Route 47, but he also destroyed his own life, his mother's life, and the lives of everyone who loved Marcus. The cost of that 15-minute act of violence will echo through generations, a permanent scar on everyone it touched, and somewhere in a maximum security prison, Cameron Mitchell sits in his cell, unchanged and unrepentant, a living example of what happens when a human being lacks the most fundamental quality that makes us human, the ability to recognize the suffering of others and care about it. He will die in that cell decades from now, having contributed nothing to the world, having taken everything from people who didn't deserve it, and having learned nothing from the consequences of his actions. That is his legacy, and that is the truest justice Marcus Sullivan will ever receive.